Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis podcast. It is February 5th, 2019, and we are very excited to be with you today after a mini hiatus. I am joined by my brilliant, I'm Dr. John DeLynn. I am joined by my brilliant, insightful, wise, dear wife, Margi.
Hi, thank you. Happy to be here.
And as always, we're joined by the brilliant, talented, experienced, seasoned, fun, joyful, witty, inspiring
so many adjectives.
co-host.
Oh, my Lanta.
What?
I think that this is like my weekly therapy. It's just being introduced by John DeLynn on this podcast.
John can provide you your daily affirmations.
Yes, this is very, very helpful. I should just record this and repeat this every day.
Welcome, Natasha, and welcome, Margi.
Margi and I will have to start one where we invite the brilliant.
Yeah, where's
next time?
Where's my affirmations? We are so excited to be here with you today. When I talk about a hiatus, it's because Margi and I and Natasha, we all did some travel. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But Natasha, you went to Thailand, right?
I did, which was like so much fun and totally out of character for me, and like for fun, like not for work. Like I actually traveled for fun.
And you went with Andy, right?
I went with my husband, and we had a great time and visited some friends, some dear friends of ours that are living over there. So
fun.
It was very, very nice.
So what's it like? What's it like to travel after you've been through a faith crisis?
Oh, well, I guess that could be its own podcast. Right? I haven't even thought about that. No. Was it different for you?
No, I was just being silly. Did you guys have what were your favorite things about traveling?
I love to travel. I love tasting new food. I love seeing new cities and sites. I love, learning about the history and the people. One of our tour guides was actually willing to talk to me about sexuality. So I Facebook Lived our little conversation on some of my sex info type of Facebook pages. So that was totally fun.
Yeah.
Very nice. Well, we're glad you had a good time, and Margi and I are going to talk about our little event in just a second, but we had a great time as well. But thanks everyone for joining us. We have a great show planned for you today. To begin, we want to, as always, begin with our mission and kind of our message. Margi, do you want to kick that off?
Sure. So our mission is to provide positive, practical, and personal tips for navigating a Mormon faith crisis. It's also for those wishing to understand those in faith crisis as well.
Yep. And our message is just that this is a huge gift. It can be a huge gift. It's going to feel painful and difficult at times, excruciating, life-ending, paradigm shattering. But what we also want you to understand is, based on our experience with counseling tens of thousands of Mormons in faith crisis by now, between the three of us, so many people find it a gift, whether or not they stay in the church or leave the church. It can be a huge gift either way in helping you create a big, beautiful life.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us. We want to remind everyone that this podcast is available on iTunes. It's available on Facebook, on our Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis Facebook page, and it's available on YouTube. You can find us at any of those places. And I'm really happy to admit that we're climbing in our usage. We're now in the thousands of downloads and views between our multiple platforms. And that means we're reaching a lot of people. So we want to give a shout out to all our listeners. And I want to give a shout out to Margi and Natasha for helping us create great content.
Well, right back at you, John DeLynn.
Thank you. Okay, each of us are coaches in our day jobs. Natasha, why don't you tell us about your coaching practice really quick?
All right. I run an online practice. I see people online and in office. You can find anything you want to about me professionally at natashaparker.org. So whether you want to see me professionally or see events I might be presenting at or things of that nature, that's where you can find out more about me.
And by the way, a shout out to Carly who's listening. Her name is spelled very Utah-ish. It's Karlye. I love it. Carly Kramer Risden. She writes, "I love Natasha's voice and laugh." So
we do too.
Carly's sending you her love.
That's so nice, because I'm actually pretty self-conscious about it because I do it a lot.
Oh, really?
But you guys make me laugh a lot, so it's kind of fun, and I'm glad people like it, and it's not like super annoying and like hyena-ish or something.
Not at all. It's like joy.
Yay!
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Margi, tell us about your practice.
Sure. So I am a certified life coach, and I tend to see people that come for work around life transitions. So, and you can also visit me if you have any questions, beautyinthenow.org.
Yeah. And Carly tells us that she's not from Utah.
Take that.
So that assumption that we
That's
made
what
isn't
happens
true.
when you box people.
And of course, I also do a little bit of coaching. It's very limited, but you can find me at johndolin.com/private practice. I support couples, individuals in faith crisis or in building a healthy, happy life. So you can always reach us out. We have a massive announcement that we're really excited about. We now finally have dates and locations for our event schedule for 2019. It's taken us a bit to get these solidified, but we're really, really excited to announce a series of events. And here they are. In February 13th, I'm doing a free evening for people in faith crisis. Again, that's February 13th at 7 o'clock at Community of Christ building. If any of you are in the Salt Lake area and want just a free 2 to 3 hour workshop, you can join us there. You'll be able to see more about that, all of these events on mormonfaithcrisis.com/events. We are going to be doing a workshop in Orem, Utah, February 15th and 16th, the evening of the 15th and the 16th. You can register for that now at mormonfaithcrisis.com/events. And we're really excited to announce several other events. We're coming to Vegas, February 22nd, 23rd, Ogden, March 8th and 9th. We're doing a mixed faith retreat, hopefully April 12th through 14th in Salt Lake City. We're coming to Gilbert, Arizona, May 3rd through 5th. Park City, we're doing a retreat. We hope to have Natasha there, June 7th through 9th. And we hope that to be an amazing experience. I'm really excited to announce that Switzerland reached out, Europe reached out, and really wanted us to have a retreat in Europe. So the Switzerland team pulled together. A huge shout out to my friends there, especially Philip Giesler. We are going to have a retreat in Switzerland, June 21st through 23rd, for all of Europe. So, and it's super cheap. We've arranged food and lodging and the tuition for a super low price. So we're hoping that you guys can join us for those who are interested, especially those who are in Europe. And then we're going to do Colorado, August 9th through 11th, Southern California, September 20th through 22nd. We have an open date for October 4th through 6th that we need to plan. So any of you who really want to bring a retreat to where you are, we've still got one slot available. Maybe we'll do the Midwest, I don't know. And then me and Margi and Natasha are going to do another mixed faith retreat November 1st through 3rd. So those are all our events. We hope you'll join us. Check us out at mormonfaithcrisis.com/events to learn more. We're so excited to get back in the swing of things with these events. They're always rated super highly. They always, we're told that they help people who are in crisis. They always get a 4.9 out of 5 rating. And we've just been told that marriages and lives have been saved from these events. So we hope you guys can spread the word and let people know and attend if you can. All right. We wanted to do a quick shout out. We have at least 6 new donors from the last time. So this podcast, we hope that it becomes sustainable. At a minimum, we want to make sure Natasha and Margi get paid for their participation in this podcast. I would sign up for that as well. But we need donors to do that. And we have about 20 donors now. I'm gonna read the names of 5 new donors. We have Toddy, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Hillary, Patricia, Mark, Meddy, and Lindsay. So shout out to our newest donors. They went to mormonfaithcrisis.com, clicked on the donation button, and signed up for a monthly donation, 10, 25, 50, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. Just know that you're not only going to be paying for good content for you, you'll also be paying for content that, you know, generations can enjoy to support them in what they need for a faith crisis. So thanks for those who are donating, and for those who want to donate, we appreciate that as well. Christine just wrote in and said she'll be at the Vegas event. So that's super exciting, Christine, to know you'll be there. We hope a lot of you will join us at these events. So let's go to our What's Working section. We want to invite our listeners. We have some people joining us right now through Facebook Live. We want to welcome them, and we want to invite them to share right now something that's working for them in their lives, and we'll read it live over the air. But Margi, what's working for you right now in your post faith crisis life? What's working for you?
Well, I'm going to let you kind of tackle our fun we had together.
Okay.
So in returning home, something that's really working for me, because I've had a little bit of a shock in temperature because it's freezing in Utah, wasn't so freezing where we were, are hot baths at night. So just a night bath, my kind of nighttime ritual is something that's really working for me. So we kind of have a tub downstairs that's bigger, and just filling her up, putting some magnesium salts, lavender in there, and reading and zoning out for a little bit before bed, just relaxing, has been wonderful. And it just makes me warm before I go to bed, which is lovely since it's cold here. So that's something that's really working for me, helping me sleep better.
And I take a bath every night in Margi's bathwater, and I love it. I don't mind. You have the sweetest bathwater.
Hope y'all enjoy that. It's the way we can serve. It's the way we can serve people.
For me, what's been working is taking my wife on an anniversary trip. We went to Mexico. We used frequent flyer miles from our time at Microsoft that we saved for over 14 years to pay for the trip. We went to Mexico. We stayed at the beach house of a dear friend. So grateful to that dear friend. And we were able to do a getaway where we had dinner and lunch and breakfast, beach walks, watch TV shows, bike rides, jacuzzi, pool time, layout time. If you have not taken your significant other on an anniversary vacation, I highly recommend it to regenerate the spark and the love, to strengthen the relationships. It really was amazing. I don't recommend coming out to your partner as a non-believer on an anniversary trip, however. That's something that people have written in before and said that they did. They chose an anniversary vacation as the time to come out to their spouse. I guess you could do that, but I don't recommend it. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know what else I loved about our trip?
What?
Is that we kind of picked a place, and then we went deep in that place. We didn't actually try to see a ton. So we got to know this little kind of village, kind of seaside, oceanside village called Punta Mita. And I really loved we got to make, kind of familiar connections there. The grocery stores or places that we love to go, or wherever it may be. It was really, really, I liked that aspect of it culturally, just going deep. And so
it was great.
Relaxation and kind of anyway. So
our listener PJ has written in. She says, I agree, Margi. She has baths with essential oils and Epsom salts.
Yeah.
So shout out to PG for what's working for her. PJ for what's working for her.
Mm-hmm.
Juliet. Hey, Juliet. She writes, sounds like Natasha's been giving you some advice. wonder what she means. Oh, because
It's about
Natasha
the
went on a
bath
trip?
water.
Oh,
It's
is that it?
sexual.
Oh, it's what? Tell us all about that, Natasha.
I'm guessing it's because you said you share her bath water. So, and I'm the sex lady. I'm guessing it has something to do with that. She can clarify.
Is that something
could
sexual?
Okay.
It can be,
Okay.
or at least sensual.
Sensual.
Sensual works.
Juliet also writes Cancun is the celestial kingdom, so we'll have to remember that. For those of you who are thinking about a vacation or an anniversary trip, it sounds like Cancun or Punta Mita or Mexico's on the menu. But Natasha, what's working for you?
So my thing is compression socks.
Oh,
Does that sound weird?
tell us all about
us.
that.
Well, I've never used them before, and I thought, they kind of sound old lady-ish. That's really judgmental of me. And I think I always kind of thought about varicose veins as a reason why people wear them.
Mm-hmm.
But on my trip to Thailand, I had a horrible time with my feet and my legs swelling, even though I stood up, even though I tried to drink lots of water. But it was a 17-hour flight. That's a long time to be kind of enclosed. So on my way back, I had bought compression socks on, as a recommendation that somebody gave me. And it was a game changer. And then I wrote like a thread about it, and people started writing in all kinds of reasons why they use compression socks, like when they run and maybe they stand in their office too long during the workday, or and I have plantar fasciitis issues, and I'm just thinking I'm just going to start wearing them more in general, not even just for travel. So compression socks on long flights for sure.
Compression socks, I love it.
I love little things like that where it makes a huge difference.
Well, because I was swollen for like 3 days in Thailand.
Yeah.
I mean, it took me a long time and then on the way back, I was fine. It was like nothing.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it was great.
And as serendipity would have it, we have a podiatrist listening to us right now. It's Juliet Burke. And she says, as a podiatrist, I recommend 15 to 20 millimeter HG socks for flying.
Wow.
Wow, that's specific.
Yeah.
Thank you, Juliet.
We appreciate it.
Juliet's going to be attending our donor. We're having an Open Stories Foundation ski day in a couple days. And she, along with some others, are going to be attending. So I get to meet Juliet soon. So hi, Juliet. Thanks for reaching out. PJ writes, I am looking into getting a weighted blanket.
Ooh, us too. I'm looking into that too. Mm-hmm.
And she also says she enjoys great books to read. That's what's working for PJ. So PJ, shout out to you. Thanks for sharing what's working for you. And Juliet's telling us that
HG.
the HG is short for mercury. So 15 to 20 millimeter mercury socks for flying. That sounds high tech. Mercury socks.
If it works,
If it works, do it.
It's brilliant. All right.
All right. So we have sort of the conclusion of a bit of a multi-part series for today. We talked in our most recent kind of episodes for January, we talked about the conversion process. Specifically, we talked about how oftentimes we think of our conversions as intellectual, but in reality, I tried to make the case through citing Jonathan Haidt that religious conversion is usually an emotional experience that often has a familial component, a social component to it. It can also, have other spiritual components to it. But we talked about all the different ways that people get converted to religion. And we also talked about how that's a natural, healthy thing for many people. And so we covered that kind of in depth. What we wanted to talk about today is the deconversion process and how deconversion happens. Again, this podcast is not just for people who are experiencing a faith crisis. It's also for people who want to understand their loved ones who are going through a faith crisis. And so for all of that, to validate those who are going through it, to express the experiences of those going through it, and to provide support for those who are trying to understand, we want to talk about the deconversion process. So for any of our listeners who want to share just briefly in the comments of one paragraph write-up of their deconversion, how it happened, sort of beginning with the emotions, but then whether it was familial or social or intellectual, spiritual, we want to hear from you, and we'll read, a little bit about your deconversion on the air as we go through these different domains. So we invite you to do that, and let's go ahead and just jump in. So the point that I felt is really important to make as we try and understand deconversion is that while many of us, many of the people that we work with in our coaching practice and in our workshops and retreats, when they talk about their deconversion, they usually do it in a very in a predictable way. They talk about, for example, well, someone shared with me the CES letter, or, and I started reading the CES letter and I lost my faith, or I was Googling something and I found the Mormon Think website and I started reading about polygamy and lost my faith, or, I stumbled on a podcast and started listening. The truth is, I want to make the argument that deconversion is a little bit more complex than that. Jonathan Haidt, as we mentioned in the previous episodes, he compares the human brain to a rider on an elephant. And the cerebrovfrontal cortex, or the logical, rational brain, is like the human sitting on the elephant, but the elephant is likened unto your amygdala, your emotional center of your brain. And whenever the rider and the elephant are both startled or scared, Jonathan Haidt makes the argument that it's the elephant that wins. It's the emotional center that wins. And the basic argument he's making is that we oftentimes make our decisions emotionally, often subconsciously, without even full conscious awareness. And then we use logic or reason to justify the decisions that we arrived at emotionally. And what I'm trying to argue is that deconversion happens the same way. Even if there is an intellectual or a logical or a historical trigger, what I've found for many, many people is that there was some sort of deep emotional trigger that either coincided with the intellectual trigger or that preceded it, that made the soil fertile for doubt. And so what I want to start with for both you, Natasha, and you, Margi, is each of you to share, if you're willing, a little analysis of your deconversion from, let's just say, from Mormon fundamentalism or Mormon orthodoxy. Natasha will acknowledge that you are still attending LDS church services, and Margi and I are not. But the point here isn't to only talk about leaving Mormonism. It's really leaving kind of Fowler stage 3 Mormon orthodoxy or fundamentalism. That's what we mean when we talk about a faith crisis. So Natasha, why don't you start? And if you could do a little bit of an analysis and talk about whether you can relate to this idea of an emotional softening preceding any other sort of actual event that may have been the trigger. Is that something you relate to in your process?
Yeah, no, for sure. Absolutely.
Tell us just a bit about that story.
Okay. And just to be, because I think honesty is really important principle for a lot of Mormons, I want to be clear that I'm attending church sporadically. Okay. So not like on a weekly basis. I think those kinds of things matter in our culture. So, all right.
But having said that, I think that's true for a lot of Mormons. The church only classifies activity as being once a month.
Yeah, so I'm probably active then. Anyway, fairly active. And I probably go even more often, just that travel is a big part of my life. Anyway,
yeah.
So as far as this fertile ground that you're talking about, that I think became a part of my emotional awareness it really started in my work as a mental health practitioner, working primarily with Mormons. And, some of my very first cases that I didn't feel that equipped, to handle coming from my training was like a mixed orientation marriage, or, the gay single adult, who's coming to me and telling me that he's not being successful in dating women, and is having homosexual experiences in his lifestyle, and how to manage that with his, desire to be an active member of our church and doesn't want to disappoint his family. And I had several mixed faith situations even back then, we're talking about like 20 years ago, where, one person is wanting to move away from the church and activity and the other person's in, and kind of the distress that they were feeling as a couple. And then in my own kind of Mormonism being triggered, in that space and setting, and women coming in with issues around feeling dismissed, within kind of this Mormon feminist narrative that I wasn't even that aware of. Like, I wouldn't have said that I was feeling dismissed, but all of a sudden they're bringing up these issues, and it's making me think twice about some of the ways that I thought about those issues, right? So all of these kind of, and perfectionism, ooh, that was a big one, so like all these wonderful, especially women diagnosed with depression, wonderful women serving in our church, doing all of these amazing things and still feeling pretty crappy about themselves, like they just were never enough. And pretty, and realizing that some of the messages that they were telling me, in session, because I was like, well, where are you getting this idea? Well, so-and-so just said that we're supposed to be doing blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, oh, that's where you're getting that idea. So right away, those first few years, I had a lot of opportunity to see my own religion through the eyes of lots of other people, and how they were interpreting and incorporating principles or doctrines or ideas into their lives that wasn't necessarily very useful or helpful or beneficial. So then that started creating this cognitive dissonance within me, where I was coming from a perspective where the gospel is always helpful, and why wouldn't anybody be happy at church? And, church is always going to help people. And there's even research to support that church-going people have better mental health and even better sex lives and all this stuff. So I came from some of that. It's interesting that when you're going through training, you listen to the things that already correlate with your beliefs. But now all of a sudden, the people in my room weren't necessarily correlating with my beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And how did that affect your testimony? Like, so let's just say, and by the way, I want to refer our listeners to Mormon Stories podcast. I did a really in-depth, wonderful interview. It's definitely one of the top, 25, 30 interviews of all time on Mormon Stories, which is saying a lot because we have over 1,000 hours of interviews. But Natasha's story is epic, and it's really worth checking out. But just to do a shortened version, Natasha, just to play devil's advocate, what does a bunch of therapy clients struggling to fit in their Mormon experience have to do with your testimony? How did that affect you?
Well, because it started not fitting my view of Mormonism, which is this idea that, of course, Mormonism, the gospel, is going to help everybody improve their lives, right? That's a very basic kind of foundational narrative that I was coming from. And now I was starting to see how actually some of these things weren't benefiting people's lives, and in fact, making it worse. And then, and only then, it's really interesting. And if you listen to my story, you start understanding how I also had been hurt by a lot of narratives in the church, but I was not necessarily in a space to recognize that or to own that or to even see it. Like, I was still in that space that if the hurts that I had experienced in the church were my fault, I was self-blaming. They couldn't be the gospel's fault, right, or the church's fault, because the church or the gospel or however, I know those are two kind of different things, but they're perfect, they're correct, they're right. So if there's any problems in my life, they have to do with me. So as I was working with people and starting to go, hey, wait a minute, some of these things are not very helpful and actually can hurt people, it started opening up some space for me to be able to see how also some of the church rhetoric had harmed me earlier in my life, specifically with issues of sexuality, issues of fitting in, issues of being worthy enough, all of those kinds of things that I had struggled with as a teenager and as a young adult, and how it affected my marriage and my self-identity and all that stuff. But I wasn't able to really look at that part of my life until other stories kind of started making me question. So me becoming an advocate for other people is what eventually helped me become an advocate for myself.
Is there anything uniquely Mormon you think about the fact that you were more oriented towards the needs and concerns of others than yourself? Or do you think that's just a human thing?
Well, I think it's a woman thing.
Yeah.
I definitely think it's a Mormon woman thing. Like, I think it's a Mormon woman thing on steroids, but it's a woman thing. Because I think in general, women, at least in the culture, in the Christian culture, which is pervasive in the United States and other cultures, are taught to self-sacrifice for the system that they're a part of, whether that's their family, their marriage, their kids. And so, I see those themes of self-sacrifice and women being unhappy with those kinds of messages in lots of different cultural contexts. It's not just Mormonism. But I think Mormonism has that a little bit on steroids.
Yeah. Okay. And so as you started feeling sympathy for all these people who are struggling, that softened you up to start looking at your own experience. And then how does that happen? Do you remember that first time where you asked yourself, wait a minute, is it possible that this isn't true, or this isn't what I thought it was? Do you remember it culminating into that sort of moment for you?
Yeah, both in my conversion and in my deconversion, I never had the moment. Like, I never had the Moroni moment. So I think for me, it's hard to pinpoint one specific day or moment or thought process. I think it just really was little by little, and, asking myself questions and then kind of pulling away from the questions and then reinserting myself into the questions. And plus, when you're training, when it's caught up in your professional life as a therapist, for me anyway, I could kind of separate things a little bit. Like, I could go to a professional training where they would say something that would challenge my faith. And I could be like, yeah, I can see that. I can get that. I can accept that. I can separate my faith and my testimony from this professional concept that maybe is more applicable to the population at large. So it was easy for me to always kind of almost separate my own personal stuff from my professional life for a long time. So little by little, that started kind of grading away as well. And so it really, I still think I'm in faith transition. And it's been a long process for me, and it continues to be. And that used to frustrate me. And now I'm actually I'm accepting and glad that it's been very long and slow, and I don't see myself as going really away from. I see myself as becoming more spiritually integrated.
I love it. And yeah, a lot of people don't even like the term faith crisis. They want to call it a faith awakening or a truth awakening. And I love that framing. We have to pick some words, so we pick
Yes.
faith crisis because that's what a lot of people.
Well, and I think that there are aspects of it that feel like a crisis, which we've been talking about, because it does make you look at your whole life, your identity, your relationships. So even though I would say I'm still in the process, I wouldn't say that there haven't been times where it hasn't felt crisis-like.
Yeah.
For sure.
And just really quickly, Natasha, if there wasn't this moment where you feel like you lost your faith, and I agree, it's always a gradual process that happens over years. I'm still peeling back layers of the onion and building new layers. Was there a moment where you're like, okay, things are different now, where it's like, I'm different. I'm different than the people around me. I'm going to have to start engaging my leadership and my ward or my family differently. Things have changed in a significant way. Can you think back to kind of a season when you had that sort of awareness or awakening?
Yeah, I think that there's been several times when that's happened. I mean, one of them was writing my first blog, where I spoke about the dangers of sinifying masturbation. And it took me like a week to press post on that blog because it was going to be the first time that I really probably publicly stated something that was in opposition to the church.
That had to have been the first time in history that a Mormon therapist came out in favor of masturbation on the internet, right?
I guess. I don't know.
It was a big moment.
It was a very big moment for me.
Yeah, it was big for me. And I'm a little old guy in Logan, Utah at the time.
But, you know, having so many of my really wonderful Mormon teenagers in my office cutting themselves and suicidal over masturbation was too much. I felt unethical not taking a stance. So that was a moment where I had to make a decision that my relationship probably with the church was going to change. I was afraid I might get disciplined, and I wasn't. So that was good, formally anyway. But I was definitely castigated professionally. And, you know, there was lots of changes started happening at that point when I took that stance as far as how I was treated in my local community. The next point was when my daughter, you know, was released as my made president because of her beliefs around, you know, her belief that gay marriage was a civil right, and also her belief that churches in general would do better with female ordination. So those were beliefs that she had. She wasn't touting them at church per se, but because she had social media posts that, you know, she was kind of released from that calling, and that changed our whole trajectory as a family, because now, you know, I'm placed in a position as a mother where my church community can no longer allow my daughter to have leadership ability in a place where, you know, her relationship with God is supposed to flourish. So that was very traumatic and difficult for me. And then another one I can think of just off the top of my head was the November 5th policy, you know, with so many of the gay and lesbian clients that I've had, and families that were directly affected, clients of mine that were directly affected by that policy, co-parenting relationships that were, you know, really tense because of that, you know, people who had been co-parenting well, but now because of this policy, were having to renegotiate their co-parenting in divorce situations, and several of my lesbian and gay married people getting excommunicated or disciplined. That was just cruel and awful, and having so many people sobbing in my office for what I thought was completely unnecessary, unchristlike tragedy was just devastating for me.
And for you, if there were, let's just say that your awakening could be reflected through statements. And I gave one like, oh, for some, it's the church isn't true. What would be some of the statements that would reflect or characterize your deconversion or your awakening? Can you name a few of them? Do any come to mind?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but I guess the thing that's coming to my mind is, for me, it's not that the church is true or not. It's the church isn't acting true.
Okay, that's one. The church is not acting true. What do you mean by that?
The church is not acting like what it preaches. We're ostracizing people. We're disciplining people. You know, if you look at the wonderful messages of Christ, and especially in the New Testament, it's all about come unto me. It's all about non-judgment. It's don't throw the stones, right? And yet we are in very punitive, disciplinary, worthiness measurement type of scenario where people who smoke or who struggle with any issue are going to feel less welcome in our settings, because at some level, if you're not adhering to all these behavioral standards, then people get released from callings or can't go to the temple, or so these things become like public. So personal worship and personal development issues become kind of publicly, even if they want to say it's confidential, as soon as people know that somebody isn't passing the sacrament or it doesn't have a calling, like it's a red flag that they don't fit in. So there's these public kind of subtle ways that people are ostracized on a regular basis just in the act of trying to worship in our church. So that did not fly. Plus, you know, we've been wrong on pretty much every social issue in the past, and we're not learning from that moving forward. So we've been about 10 to 15 years behind on racial issues, 10 to 15 issues behind on women's issues, and Like if we're the true church, we should be ahead of the time, not behind the time, right? And there are churches that are ahead of the time and who are advocating for social justice change. So that became, not an issue of faith for me, but almost like an advocacy of my faith, that my church isn't practicing the faith I've been taught to believe in.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Well, Margi and I are each going to share our experiences as well, but some of you as listeners are gratefully writing in a little bit about your deconversion. So we're going to sprinkle those in as we go. Christine, we're grateful for your participation today. Christine writes, I didn't come to find out it wasn't true like most I hear of. She writes, I struggled with my morals not lining up with the church most of my life until one day I realized my love for others had grown to a point I couldn't condone certain beliefs. So I'm guessing she was, I won't guess, but she writes, I didn't know if the church was true or not, but I knew even if it was, I didn't want to be a part of it. After I came to believe it wasn't true, which was a relief to know God wasn't necessarily someone that judged people, I didn't. I also still attend church with my family. Okay, so she's still attending, but for her beliefs around spirituality and what God is like evolved to the point where they just didn't match what the church was teaching about God, and I think that's really common.
Mm-hmm.
So Christine,
mm-hmm.
you did too?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing, Christine.
Okay.
A few others have shared. We'll read yours as well as the session goes. If any else of you want to share a little blurb about your deconversion, if you've had one, we'd love to hear it. So for me, I often talk about the impetus to my faith crisis being that of being called as a seminary teacher. When I worked for Microsoft, and around 2000, 2001, studying church history in depth and losing my faith. But I think, and Margi, I'm curious if you would agree, I think it started much earlier than that. Is that true?
I already agree.
Why are you nodding?
I already agree.
Wait, I was a faithful, righteous priesthood holder when we got married, wasn't I?
That's not what I mean.
What do you mean?
Just that when we met, one of the first things you kind of shared with me in vulnerability was the letter that you wrote to Oaks, and your experience with your mission and feeling on some level like there was some integrity amiss in that situation. And clearly if you spelled it out, that something would be done, and you just had to go high enough, and sharing that letter with me. And I think at that point, things were kind of shifting with regard to that. So that's what I mean. Yeah. So if I'm going way, way, way back, I think the first chip in my faith crisis was my parents getting divorced. Because when you're really bought and sold on this eternal marriage thing, and then all of a sudden your parents are getting divorced and remarried and resealed, a couple things happen. One is all of a sudden you wonder how the plan of salvation fits you. If it's all about eternal families and it's all about returning with your family, and all of a sudden you don't know who you're sealed to anymore as a kid, you don't know what that family's going to be like when there's step parents there and other people's kids. That becomes heaven becomes a sad heaven all of a sudden instead of a happy heaven. So that was a thing. But also, not only did it cause me to be sad about wondering what heaven would be like, it made me sensitive to people for whom the plan of salvation didn't fit. Because, here I was struggling with a broken family, and then all of a sudden I'm like, well, what about anyone else? I wonder if there are other people who also feel like they don't fit or the gospel doesn't fit for them. That was something that really stayed with me emotionally and probably caused me to question more. And so even though I was devout through high school and served a mission, and was really orthodox and obeyed all the commandments that, in a really orthodox way, I think it made me think a little bit out of the box and have a little bit of sympathy for marginalized groups. And that, then Margi, as you mentioned on my mission, you can read about this. The very first Mormon Stories podcast episode, I tell my mission story. But long story short, I had a corrupt mission with what felt like to me a spiritually corrupt mission president, where they were baptizing
750 people a month. Some missionary companionships were baptizing 40 a month. And they were basically just going out to a field recruiting little 7, 8, 9-year-olds who were super poor, taking them back to church when they were hot and baptizing them in a baptismal font, 10 at a time, without ever having attended church, without parental permission, without any testimonies, just fill in the sheets so that you could make the numbers. And these companionships were getting 40, 50 a month. And then they became zone leaders, and they became assistants to the president. And like you said, Margie, that was really traumatic for me. And the mission president supported this behavior. So I confronted the mission president, and he yelled at me. And it was the first time I had really experienced ecclesiastical abuse. And I don't know if a man experiences like a woman does, but when your priesthood leader is yelling at you, saying, "Never question us. How dare you question us? Don't ever question us again." It leaves this dark mark inside of you, especially when you feel like you're doing right and you're fighting for something God and Jesus would support. And so when I got home from my mission, and I wrote Elder Oaks and I wrote church headquarters to let them know about this, and the answer I got was, "Well, your mission president's almost done with this 3 years. We don't want to cause a big stink. We're going to just kind of let it go." That was really troubling for me. And it was the first time I wondered whether the church was rotting from the head, not from the feet. And of course, I didn't lose my testimony then either. I still attended BYU and got married in the temple, still consider myself very faithful. But it was this emotional jolt that not only did I now have sympathies for people for whom the church didn't fit, I also had deep sympathies and concern that the church leadership could not only not be perfect, but could be corrupt. And of course, I covered that in, well, the church is perfect, but the leaders aren't, or the members aren't. And that carried me another 5, 10 years into a temple marriage and 4 kids and faithful participation in wards. But that really softened me up. And I think, Margie, you'd agree, even though I behaved in an Orthodox way and didn't drink and didn't drink tea or coffee, or there was a bit of a troubled soul about me. Is that fair to say?
I would probably say you had a little inner rumbling at times.
Yeah.
It wasn't always apparent, but it did come out from time to time.
But still Orthodox, would you say?
Yeah, I think you were still think back to General Conference and who was the one that was like, the kids are sitting. And so I think
every General Conference, everyone had to sit through all hours of all General Conferences, every General Conference weekend.
Bake cookies.
I'm like, sit down and watch General Conference. We're all going to watch the whole, take notes, everybody. And my kids
oh my gosh, this is cracking me up. I can totally see this.
Can't you?
Yeah, but I want to say really quickly, because I know this is a total tangent, but ecclesiastical abuse of males in our church is real. And I've had so many clients in my office talking about that. And I think it's something we don't ever talk about. So now I'm thinking I need to do a Mormon mental health podcast on that. Sorry.
Great idea.
I want to validate you, John.
Thank you. Yeah, and a shout out to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. It had a great year in 2018. Grew in downloads and in support and donations. Check out Mormon Mental Health Podcast. Natasha runs it. It's a great thing, and she deserves support. So, So I think all that is what softened me for that time where I was called as a seminary teacher, and then I wanted to study church history in depth. So I started studying several church books, and then I learned about the Book of Abraham and the papyrus, and how it wasn't a translation from Joseph Smith like we thought, which then led me to learn about polygamy, which then led me to learn about polyandry, which then led me to learn about Book of Mormon historical problems. And that's kind of when I went down the rabbit hole around 2001. And then it became very much an intellectual awakening, but it definitely began as an emotional one that was sort of this chronic low burn of discomfort for a couple of decades. And I'll also add that when I learned about the suicide of Stuart Mattis in 2000, this young gay returned missionary who drove himself up to the steps of his Mormon stake center, pinned a note to his chest that said, "Do not resuscitate," and then shot himself on the steps of the church stake center. I learned about that while I was an employee at Microsoft around 2000. And that became, oh my gosh, there's another marginalized group, not just divorced people, but LGBT people. That became my next awakening. And of course, later I became more sensitive to feminism and people of color. I mean, the Black priesthood man always bothered me. But I didn't understand racism and systemic racism and sexism and homophobia until I started Mormon Stories. But that's how my faith crisis, and for me, it was very much the church isn't true. Oh my gosh, I thought this was God's one true church on the earth. I thought that God's prophet, that Ezra Benson or Gordon B. Hinckley was God's prophet. This is the one true church. And they would never lie to me. They would never hurt me. They would never deceive anyone. For me, that's what the main, verbal narrative was, oh my gosh, what if the church isn't true? I think the church may not be true, or I think the church may not be what it claims to be. And I do remember just a very specific day where for the very first time, in spite of all the problems I had been collecting, all the elements on my shelf, I'd never been able to really seriously ask myself to consider the possibility that it wasn't true. And that's what hit me. And that's when I came to Margi. And so that was kind of my awakening and how it happened. Very much emotional before it was intellectual. Let's go ahead and read another narrative from our listeners. Do you want to read this, Margi, from PJ?
Sure.
Okay.
For me, it was all three. From some of the teachings that would not sit right, like the only true church, to when my husband was in the hospital with possible heart issues, realizing if he passed away, I could not get remarried in the temple. And then some personal bad treatment from members. My health going downhill, dealing with a chronic illness and struggling to go to church, also taking care of 2 special needs kids, to eventually my second daughter coming out as bisexual. That is when I left for good.
Thank you, PJ, for sharing something so personal. And yes, she runs the gamut from emotional issues, personal health and well-being, family members whose health and well-being might be challenged, to feminist issues around how maybe she hadn't been prepared, and how because she was a woman, she couldn't remarry in the temple, whereas men can remarry in the temple after a spouse passes away. Thank you, PJ, for sharing. Others, if you want to share, we'd love to read your narratives. Margi, what was it like for you? How would you describe your deconversion from Mormon Orthodoxy?
Yeah, that's kind of tough for me. I kind of feel like on a level, my nest of how I grew up was a little bit of a, that emotional preparing. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but with my dad being a psychiatrist and a lot of emphasis in our home on, what makes people act the way they do and how minds work. And I think as well as being a convert and growing up, you talked about kind of feeling on the outside once your family, once your parents got divorced. For me, I had relatives and really good friends, and my life was filled with all these wonderful people that on some level I had to conceive weren't gonna make it or weren't gonna, and it just never really clicked.
To the celestial kingdom, you mean?
To the celestial kingdom.
Even if for you it hadn't even occurred that they could have been taught in the spirit world and accepted the gospel.
Yeah, none of that really. And that's why, and then you lay on top of that I was not really, my testimony was very much the lived testimony. I wasn't highly doctrinal or in the way I think my testimony was made. It was very much kind of a lived experience. I think all of that kind of contributed a bit to a nest of, a little bit of a distance, if you will, from my relationship with the church that allowed it for me to kind of see things from many angles and a little bit, I don't know, that's kind of how I would think about it. Is that what you were asking?
But
So that's kind of the emotional nest of where I came into it.
Okay.
And then from there, I'm just a highly relationship person. So to have Scott, my cousin, I'm really close to, I grew up with him. He's one of the best people I know, come out to me and see the pain and suffering in his life.
As gay.
That was one thing that I think really made me feel in an instant really different about things. I think also your and my relationship with authority, both of us had an experience with a type of authority figure within the paradigm of the church kind of structure that made me really sensitive about that made me less obedience-minded, I think, than I would have been. So, and then of course you came to me. That was one of the first kind of things was, here's this person that I really love and I really respect, who is, I've seen struggling, I've seen really wrestle with things and speaking really vulnerably about, the things that you had learned up to that point. I think all of those things came together in a manner of like a perfect storm that allowed for me to pull away and then slowly kind of break down and rebuild to a point that I was no longer able to have an experience within the church that felt true to me anymore.
What was it? What do you remember feeling when I sat you down and said, do you remember the words I used and how you heard it and how it felt when I came to you about my doubts?
Yeah, well, I remember feeling...
What do you remember? Tell that story. I want to hear it.
You want to hear
it?
Yeah. So the way I remember it was that you waited until we had put our kids to bed and you pulled me into our room. You sat down, you were shaking, your voice was shaking, which is kind of a rare thing for you. And you said, I have something I want to tell you. And right there, I pretty much like panicked and felt like this most likely is like, this may be a moment where my life is no longer the same. And then I remember you really having a lot of emotion saying, I know that you have noticed that I haven't been myself and I've been reading things and, here are some of the things that I've been reading, and what I've come to is I don't believe that the church is what it says it is. I don't think it is true. And I remember crying. I just immediately started crying.
What went through your mind?
Oh, and even with my fears and on my Mormon story, I tell you about the fears that immediately came up for me, which is my marriage is not going to last, death, and it affecting my children in some way down the line in a way that was really going to be sad for them. It went right to all my relationships, I think, and it went right to that sort of stability and structure that I now am highly aware in my personality that I appreciate and love. And I just really felt completely in an instant, like very, very vulnerable. Like I compare it to like a snail without a shell in an instant. You just feel extremely exposed and in full on panic mode.
Yeah. Well, sorry I did that to you.
Oh, no need to apologize, because that's the whole point, I think, of where we are today and why we're here and sitting here.
And then what did you do for your own deconversion? I shared with you what I read, but did you have steps to go after that to kind of come to your own conclusions?
Yeah, and I think I was quite holistic about it. I did some intellectual, like all the things that we talk about as sort of the tenets to deconversion, whether it's familial or the intellectual or the social. I feel like I had a very holistic process. So I read Fawn Brody, I did some intellectual kind of, but I also, dove into some Buddhism. I practiced yoga. I started building it within myself, principles that made sense to me, that resonated to me. And that was really, really helpful. And inevitably, I would say that's the thing that then played out when I went to church over time. I'd say wait, this is actually not reflecting who I am anymore. My experience now is not, reflecting what I value and the way I want to live and how I want to love and walk in the world.
Right. Natasha, anything you want to share as a reflection on what you've heard?
I just, I did have a reaction when you said sorry that I did that to you. And, which, I mean, I kind of get, and I think that this is the position that a lot of spouses are in. It's like, first of all, a believing spouse, oftentimes that's dealing with a transitioning spouse, can feel like, I didn't ask for this, right? Like, you did do this to me. And at the same time, I think it's not that we're doing something to each other. It's that you chose to show up. You chose to show up honestly with your wife. And if that's doing something to you, well, then that's marriage, right? And we have to understand, I think, and we don't really talk about this very much, I think, in the premarital expectations, that if you're going to spend these days, hopefully, with life expectancy being what it is, 50 to 60 years. I mean, if you get married in your 20s and you're going to stay with this one person, you're going to spend probably 50 to 60 years. And if you think that you're not going to change in some way, or that there's going to be some significant developmental process that you both go through in that space of time, I think it's really unfortunate that we have this idea that we're doing change to each other. I'm like, no, we just change. And then hopefully we show up in that change and be present for one another as we do that.
Absolutely.
So that was the only little thing that I wanted to just, John.
Yeah. So can I say something about that too?
Yes.
Like, do we believe this is a gift or don't we? Because then we can turn that right around. And I can say, I really can appreciate where we are and it really feels good to us. And so that is part of the gift. You were on a level, the giver, the initial giver of the gift. And just one other thing is sometimes gifts don't feel good in the moment, right? Like we oftentimes in our brains think of good equals, good feelings, pleasure, and that's just not quite how life works. That some of the best things that John and I have experienced that have allowed for us to grow and now experience joy were, at least initially, and I would say largely, painful to kind of come to. And that is just kind of the reality of it. So, goodness can come from sadness and, some suffering initially.
Well, you're welcome then.
Well, we have so many like cultural cliches, like no pain, no gain, or like we whether it's Mormon or just general culture, I think there's an understanding that things that are worthwhile usually require painful processes to get through. And I think long-term marriage where you really have intimacy intact is something that's ongoingly developing and with two individuals who are changing. And it is hard and there is going to be pain.
Yep.
That pain is real. And yet, at least for now, the two of you have persevered through that. And I think
she said at least for now.
Because I'm not in any way a fortune teller.
And how do we live, John? Day by day. Day by day. Rambo. It's like marriage, we say I do in every moment. We commit every day, every moment.